Revolutionary greetings to our comrades out there, allies of the left, and the friendly forces that we have. My name is Hlengiwe Nkonyane. I'm a full-time revolutionary at the South African Communist Party offices. I am your host today. This podcast episode today is streaming live on Facebook and also on our YouTube channel. Please do follow our social pages, subscribe to our YouTube channel, and do also click on the notification button so that you'll be kept updated on all our episodes that will be happening. Today is officially our first online podcast being streamed, and we are honored to be hosting Comrade Reneva Fourie, who's a doctor by academic. Dr. Reneva Fourie is a Central Committee member. She is an analyst focusing on policy, on governance, on security, and she's a writer. Comrade Reneva Fourie is a writer, an activist, and also an internationalist. Greetings, Comrade Reneva, and welcome to the Red Mic podcast.
Good afternoon, Hlengiwe, and good afternoon to everyone who's listening. I'm honored to be the first person on our online podcast that is going live.
Thank you, Comrade Reneva. As you noticed, we started the show with the communist anthem, which is the Internationale, because the subject matter that we are tackling today has to deal with our international solidarity. The South African Communist Party released a statement condemning the Israeli-Palestine aggression in Syria and also calling for the unity in Syria. Just so that we begin, can you just give us an overview on the situation in Syria as we speak?
Okay, as you know, there's been a regime change in Syria in December last year, and currently the administration that is in government is the HTS. It used to be called Al-Nusra before, and it has since rebranded Al-Nusra, which was a spin-off of Al-Qaeda, and it has since rebranded to be the Hayat Tahrir al-Shama. So it still has an element of extremist tendencies. However, they are now saying that they're trying to advocate to retain the secular format of Syria. However, when there was the fall of Damascus, very soon after that, we saw Israel destroying all the defense capabilities of Syria, almost up to 90% of the defense capabilities. And the new president of Syria his pseudonym is Cholani, but its president Shahar. He has repeatedly indicated that they don't want any war in Syria, that now that they've taken over, they're not going to allow the establishment of Hezbollah bases, they're not going to allow support for Hamas, they're not going to allow any interaction with Iran. So in reality, that kind of aggression by Israel is completely unjustified. It's ironic because it is alleged that Israel was instrumental in ensuring that the Ba'ath Party was overthrown and that HTS came into power. It is ironic because at the time, Syria was perceived as granting protection to the Palestinians. Syria was perceived as being part of the axis of resistance. And so one would have assumed that now that the HTS is in power, now that the pro-American, pro-Israeli entity is in power, that the aggression against Syria will stop. But it's not. It's escalated. It's continued. Up even now on Monday, there was a series of attacks, both airstrikes and ground strikes. But worse is that Netanyahu issued a statement saying that he's doing these interventions because he's protecting one of the communities in Syria, which is called the Druze community, which is not at all that is not the reason why they are there. In fact, the IDF, or the Israeli Defense Force, has now occupied even more territory in Syria, south of Damascus, and their justification for being there is they're saying they're doing that to protect the Druze community. And that, of course, is sowing division, not just among Syrians, but it's also sowing division within that community, because they identify as Syrians and not as Israelis. I can go on and on. Should I?
Yes, if you can give us a full scope on exactly what is happening in Syria so that we could all have the picture painted out in clear form.
Okay, I'm going to start by describing Syria, because a lot of people, they have this perception of just a war-torn country. However, Syria is very beautiful. It is a secular state. It is the home to much of civilization. In fact, Damascus is the oldest habitable city in the world. And the women in Syria at the time, before the takeover in December, were very assertive, highly educated. Syria was among the first countries to not compel women to wear a veil. Syria was among the first countries who allowed women, first Arab countries to allow women the vote. Syria was the first country to send a woman as a UN representative. So women enjoyed full rights in Syria. Likewise, all religions, like people don't really even, at the time, prior to December, people didn't even differentiate between religions. So whether they were Christian or whether they were Muslim, they celebrated all kinds of holidays. And within the religious community itself, the mosques were very encompassing. So whether you were Alawite, which is one of the sects that former President Assad comes from, whether you were a Sunni, whether you were Shia, it didn't matter. You know, that kind of differentiation didn't exist in Syria prior to December last year. Also, what is important to note is that prior to the conflict in Syria, that's prior to 2010, they had a poverty rate of less than 5%. So it is a very wealthy country, it was a very self-sufficient country, and the people were very jovial. It is unfortunate then that when President Bashir al-Assad, so it's a socialist country, of course, and because of its socialist orientation, it was part of what was deemed the axis of resistance, which is Iran and Hezbollah in Lebanon, and then some of the Palestinian resistance movements. And the axis of resistance primarily was to ensure that Western interests are not advanced in the region, and also to ensure that, or to support the Palestinians in their struggle for liberation. However, when President Bashar al-Assad came into power in 2010, in 2000, he introduced a series of neoliberal reforms, and that is why, as the Communist Party, we're so sensitive around austerity measures and neoliberal reforms, because we can see the impact that it has on the working class, on the poor. And given that Syria was such a strong socialist country, when these neoliberal reforms came, the people couldn't adjust fast enough because they had free healthcare, free education, food packs, and now there were all this, the SOEs started to have private sector participation. So when the Arab Spring happened, there were people in Syria that then participated in that Arab Spring because they wanted to express their dissatisfaction with the government, not to a point of a war. However, the Arab Spring was then hijacked, and a whole lot of foreign entities came And by 2014, even America occupied the north part of Syria where there's oil. And they then took the area that occupied, they now have control of 90% of the oil. Well, the Syrian government resisted. The death toll was very high. I think over 300,000 people died. Many people were displaced. But at the end of the day, by 2015, they got assistance from Russia. By the end of the day, by 2019, they were able to establish a truce. So there was relative stability within Syria, and a lot of transformation started to happen. This transformation was more people-centered than neoliberal because the people were still suffering. So there was like the people would get vouchers for food, vouchers for energy, and just to ensure that people were having a living. Unfortunately, then, America intensified its sanctions in 2020. There was always sanctions against Syria, but before that, the sanctions were against specific individuals, and the sanctions were mainly prohibiting those individuals from traveling. However, this sanctions that was established that's called the Caesar Act. It was enacted in 2019, but it only came into fruition in 2020. And the impact of that Caesar Act was devastating because it was saying that anyone that trades with the Syrian government will be sanctioned. So whether you were in Lebanon, whether you were in South Africa, regardless of where you were, if you interacted with Syria in any way, then you were vulnerable to sanctions. So even us, as you know, we spent 4 years in Syria. We had great difficulty because of the SWIFT system doing financial transactions. So even doing from your one personal account to your other personal account, purely because you were based in Syria, you had to struggle to do that financial transaction. I did my PhD during that period when I was there, and I could not access libraries in South Africa because of the sanctions, even if you use a VPN. So, needless to say, the impact of the sanctions overnight was devastating. When we arrived in Syria for £80,000, we could buy a whole trolley full of food. When we left Syria for £80,000, we could only buy 2 avocado bears. The Syrian pound went from 47 Syrian pounds in 2010 to 47 pounds to the dollar in 2010. But by December 2024, it was 12,900 Syrian pounds to the dollar. So the inflationary impact was just so severe. And that made the people of Syria very vulnerable. So it was, remember, they were a rich country before. They never had poverty before. Now they were at levels of 90% poverty. The cost of living was just completely unaffordable. They couldn't access their oil. This is an oil-rich country where petrol was very cheap before. Now the oil was under the control of the Americans, and if they wanted oil, they needed to buy oil. And they could get oil from Iran, but ever so often, the Israelis would strike the port, Latakia port, like they did on this Monday. Actually, they struck Latakia again. So the constant striking of the airport, the curtailment of access to food and oil, and the devastating impact of inflation, and then of course the historical impact of the war had led Syrians to be tired of war, tired of suffering. And I think that's one of the reasons why the Syrian government, when they saw this onslaught starting from the end of November 2024, it's one of the reasons why they just capitulated. President Assad steps down. So they thought, okay, if the president steps down, for the sake of our people, hopefully things will be better. So they stepped down. But then soon after that, the promises that were made with liberation, like within weeks after that, it never materialized, because then what happened is they said people are not going to be persecuted, but people that were associated with the religious background of the president, the Alawites, started to be persecuted. Ordinary civil servants that didn't have any political allegiance, they started to be harassed. Journalists that didn't have any political allegiance, they started to be harassed. Christians also started to be harassed. There was, like for the first time ever that I can remember, but during our period, both Muslims and Christians would celebrate Christmas and of course Eid. But for the first time last year, December, there were attacks on people celebrating who wanted to celebrate Christmas, and the burning of Christmas trees, which was like just so unusual. So now we're seeing this rise of sectarianism in Syria. We're seeing increased restrictions on women and the behavior of women. By the end of January, they banned the Ba'ath, or they're not banned, but they disbanded the Ba'ath Party, the Unified Syrian Communist Party, all the trade unions. So the concern for the party in terms of our statement was two elements. The one is that, look, the Syrian government must recognize that the interest of apartheid Israel is, they've never been consistent, they've never been loyal. The Americans have never been reliable. I mean, look at what they're doing to Zelensky now. They drove him into a war and now they're stabbing him in the back. So we're saying, don't allow imperialists to dictate your sovereignty. Appreciate your territorial integrity, and when people invade your territory, when they attack your territory, you must be assertive around defending it. We understand now that they don't have the military capability, but at least they should liaise with the international community to say that, no, what is happening is not fair. Then secondly, with regards to the issue of unity, firstly, the Druze community was part of the people in Syria that resisted the external onslaught. So they fought with the government. And now Netanyahu is trying to make it seem like these Druze don't identify as Syrians, but they do. So we, as the party, we are saying that we recognize that the people of Syria in the past were united in the defense of their territorial integrity. They were united in defense of their culture and their very beautiful, rich history, and that they shouldn't allow external or imperialist forces to divide them. Likewise, HDS, if it's serious about national unity, if it is serious about building a united and peaceful and stable Syria, then they can't do it by dissolving the Ba'ath Party, which has a huge support in Syria. They can't do it by dissolving the trade union movement, which covers almost every sector in Syria, whether it is sports, whether it is music, whether it is just labor, all the different sectors. There's a trade union for that. The art sector, the film industry, all of that now has been dissolved. And you can't do it excluding those people. You can't do it excluding the Unified Syrian Communist Party, because they also have a large support. So if we are talking about rebuilding Syria, all those voices need to be included. And also we can't allow external forces to try and dissolve, to create tension within the country. Now, what is significant in that regard is that last week, on the 24th and the 25th of February, they had a national dialogue. So the national dialogue was supposed to be the equivalent of South Africa's CODESA. However, they did not have party representatives at that event. They had hand-picked individuals, about 600 individuals, and these 600 individuals broadly discussed what should be the way forward for Syria. Then they have a small committee that has been appointed by the president who will determine the new constitution or the interim constitution until they go to elections in 5 years' time. Now, with us, our constitution was drawn up by a constituent assembly. We had an election that was based on proportional representation, and then from 1994 to 1996, the constitution was drafted. The interim constitution was also an outcome in South Africa, was also an outcome of extensive negotiations that started officially in 1991 and continued right up until 1993 for the formulation of the interim constitution. So there's no way that a few individuals can draft a constitution and then expect that constitution to be reflective of the people of Syria. So yes, of course, we respect we respect Syria as a sovereign entity. We don't want to dictate how they run things, but because we have an interest in humanity generally, because we want a peaceful society generally, because at a personal level I have a vested interest in ensuring in appreciating a stable and peaceful Syria, and because we are internationalist, we are saying that the new Syrian government mustn't allow themselves to be used. They mustn't allow themselves to be manipulated by imperialist forces, and they must sincerely try to be as inclusive as possible.
Thank you, Comrade Reneva, for that in-depth overview, giving us the historical overview, the situation currently on the ground on the civilians, the transition phase and what has happened. I think that was very informative. Now it gives us a broader picture of understanding where we are currently. I just want us to get to discuss the historical context of the Israeli-Palestine conflict and how it relates to the situation in Syria.
Okay, so, there's two ways of looking at it. We would say that we would call the current, what's labeled as the current state of Israel, occupied Palestinian territory. Okay? So all of that land historically belonged to the Palestinians. And the Palestinians, like the Syrians, were comprised of Christians, Muslims, and Jews. During the Balfour Declaration, that land, the whole concept of a two-state, or let's say that land was given as for the creation of the state of Israel, if one could say so, after World War II, and everyone was devastated by the impact of the Holocaust. The British promised people that were affected by the Holocaust that they can take other people's country, which was then Palestine, and they named it the State of Israel. Obviously, the Palestinians resisted because it was their country. It led to a major exodus, that was 1948, and when people fled, many of the people fled into Syria, into Jordan, into what is this kingdom? Okay, we'll get there. Into the whole of West Asia, which is what they prefer to call it. But the resistance continued within Palestine, and then what had happened is then it was the 1967 war, and senior Assad was then, the Ba'ath Party had just come into power in Syria, so they were active in supporting the Palestinians in their war. They initially won the war, actually. But then, with the interventions of Egypt, they then reached a compromise, and a lot of the occupied territory, or the compromise was then the two-state solution. We would have the state of Israel and the state of Palestine. It was just a suggestion that was never actually realized. But since from the onset, the Syrian people and the Palestinian people, because of the common culture, the common language, there was a strong common identity that was formed. So the pain of the Palestinian people, the Syrian people empathized with it. It was as if they were affected directly too. Anyway, it's a very long history. Coming back to the conflict in Syria, it was very complicated because some of the forces in Palestine formed part of the forces that tried to dismantle or to overthrow the Assad government. Largely that was related to religious sectarianism, in that Syria is a secular state, and people who deem all the things that they did as haram or sinful. The women are their loose flowy hair and their tight jeans and short skirts, and people smoking, people drinking alcohol. So they weren't exactly Sharia compliant. And so some of the Palestinian forces thought that they aligned themselves with the Islamic jihadists in Syria that wanted to overthrow the Ba'ath Party. Ultimately, though, that relation, post-2019, the tensions that existed between organizations like Hamas and the Ba'ath Party administration, it dissipated because people started to appreciate that they have a common enemy, which is the Zionist entity and the imperialist forces as championed by the United States of America. On the other hand, the Syrian government has a good relationship with the Palestinian Authority, with the Palestinian Liberation Organization, but by the late 2019s, early 2020, most of the Palestinian, they call it Palestinian factions, but not in the same way that we interpret factions. Just say the various Palestinian entities had representatives in Syria. So whether it was your Islamic Jihad, but not the radical Islamic Jihad that is associated with the media like ISIS. It's just a liberation movement in Palestine that's called Islamic Jihad, Hamas, the Communist Party of Palestine. All of them had representation in Syria. And also, of course, Syria hosted many of the Palestinians that were in exile. Palestine has an embassy there. But as the war in Palestine, post October 7, now 2023, given the horrific genocide that occurred in Gaza, it was hard for anyone, even including South Africans, but particularly people within the Levant region, to just ignore it. If I'm just thinking of Syria, at least half our staff were Palestinian. So everybody was glued to the news. In fact, what is called Palestine is not far from Syria. It's about 180 kilometers. So it was directly affected, and as a consequence, the Syrian government allowed military bases to be set up in Syria to enable the Palestinians to better defend themselves. They allowed Hezbollah to set up military bases in Syria to allow the Lebanese to better defend themselves. And while Syria was always a target of imperialist forces, the determination to neutralize the Ba'ath Party administration just escalated post 7 October, because they could now see that the Palestinian resistance were, they were massacring tens of thousands at a time. They were destroying the Hezbollah leadership, but the resistance continued and the resistance continued. So the determination to put an end to the resistance, they believe, it would assist them if they get rid of the Syrian government, which they did. They've effectively managed now to neutralize Syria. Why the aggression in Syria is ongoing is one can't understand, because they have a pro-Israeli government in power right now. The idea would be that they wanted to crush the axis of resistance, which they've relatively done successfully, because Hezbollah now, most of the top leadership of Hezbollah has been killed, most of the top leadership of Hamas has been killed. The Syrian government is no longer in power, and Iran now is totally isolated. Yemen has been destroyed, Iraq has been destroyed. Those entities that were supporting the resistance have been considerably weakened. Although, of course, people are still resilient. No person is going to tolerate being oppressed. So they're finding ways to resist. It is most unfortunate that Netanyahu hasn't abided by any of the ceasefires, whether it was the ceasefire with the Palestinian resistance forces, whether it was the ceasefire with the Lebanese resistance forces. As we know, the activities in Jenin is still ongoing. They've now, in Gaza, despite the ceasefire, they are now blocking access to food, so the humanitarian aid can't come through. So while they're not bombing people in Gaza, but they're still killing people in West Bank, they are now trying to starve the people to death, like they did with Syria. They tried. The Caesars Act was meant to effect regime change through starving the people of Syria. So they're applying that now to Gaza. It is very unfortunate because it's two days into Ramadan, and it was so admirable of the Palestinian people that despite the horrific conditions, despite the devastation, despite the destruction of the infrastructure around them, they still made the effort to gather, to make things beautiful, to celebrate Iftar with the little resources that they have. And even that little bit of happiness, the Zionist regime is now trying to deprive them of that. During the month of Ramadan, it's the degree of insensitivity, it's unfathomable. And now worse, there's President Trump, who is going on a rampage, who is saying ever so casually that the people from Gaza can be displaced, they can be moved to Jordan or anywhere else in the region, while he converts Gaza into a holiday, like a Riviera resort. I mean, where's the shame? There's absolutely. I'm honestly speechless at the lack of humanity, the lack of compassion, the lack of empathy. They speak of the people of the Levant region as if they are not people, as if they don't have hopes, as if they don't have aspirations, as if they don't have dreams. These children, these beautiful children, are being slaughtered. The ones that are not being slaughtered are being deliberately maimed. And the kind of brutality that is being exerted in Gaza, on a smaller scale, it is also happening now in Syria. There is an allegation that Israel wants to expand its territory. So it's already occupying the Golan Heights in Syria. But there was a dream once sold in some of the religious communities that all of that area, Lebanon, Syria, and Palestine, should belong to the Zionist community. I can't say the Jewish community because there's tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands possibly of Jews that don't identify with the Zionist agenda. They don't identify with the genocide. And they don't want to be associated with it in any way. So we can't say it's the Jewish community that wants to expand the territory. It is exclusively this small group of Zionists backed by the USA, but also backed by the UK and France, and some of the Middle Eastern countries like Saudi Arabia to a lesser extent, and Qatar, that is enabling the Zionist and the US imperialist agenda in the West Asian region.
Thank you very much, Comrade Reneva, on giving us that educational background on the Israeli-Palestine conflict and the spillage of the aggression of the Israeli over to Syria, and highlighting the shared commonalities that the Palestine people share with Syria. Now I just want to jump in and talk to you as a Central Committee member of the party, and to ask you in terms of what is the stance of the SACP on the plight of the Palestinian people?
I'm very proud to say that the SACP has always been aligned with the plight of the Palestinian people. We support their right to self-determination. We support the right to resist. We had the formation of Umkhonto weSizwe. The South African Communist Party was part of the formation of Umkhonto weSizwe with the ANC and with SACP, who's what's now called COSATU, and its formation anniversary is being celebrated this week. So there's a very long history in terms of the relationship with the Palestinian movement and the liberation movement in South Africa, which we are a part of. So yes, we've always been vocal. We try and support the Palestinian struggle, both in terms of protest, in terms of signing declarations. We've also had a program where we were writing letters to people in prison, particularly children in prison. Yes, I think the stance of the SACP cannot be removed from the stance of the liberation movement as a whole. And the manifestation of that stance is demonstrated through our government's actions at the International Criminal Court of Justice, and also the affirmation of our president, despite huge threats of now sanctions against South Africa, that should those who have been charged for the atrocities in Gaza visit South Africa, that have been charged by the International Criminal Court, we will arrest them. So I think that our country has been very brave. The Palestinians hold us in very high regard. They appreciate all that we do. Like I said, the Syrians and the Palestinians, they don't differentiate. And for many of the oppressed community in South Africa, we don't differentiate between ourselves and the people of Palestine. The pain of the Palestinians, we feel it because we've been there. We've witnessed the kind of segregation that they've been exposed to because we experienced it ourselves. We witnessed the repression that they were exposed to because we experienced it ourselves. We appreciate their right to determination because we also fought our own liberation struggle. So for us, the quote of Nelson Mandela has been expressed so often, but it's not rhetoric for us. It's something that we feel deep in our hearts. South Africans can never be free for as long as the Palestinians are not free. Especially, there's not even it's something that we feel very, very strongly. Of course, there's the other issues which would have been immaterial in that they supported us with our liberation struggle in terms of material support and also emotional support, just general solidarity. But even if they hadn't done it, the occupation is wrong. Genocide is wrong. It is morally incorrect. And so even from a moral perspective, as the South African Communist Party, we would have identified with the people of Palestine and would have supported them, just like we support all other oppressed people in the world.
So, just to add, how does the South African Communist Party stance against the aggression of the Israeli add to the commitment of the party's stance against anti-imperialism?
Well, we start by saying that we attribute a large amount of the problems that we're currently experiencing in the world, poverty, unemployment, inequality, we place capitalism at the root of that, because the capitalist system is one that prioritizes profit over people, and I know that sounds like a slogan, but when you see its brutal manifestation, you see workers being exploited, being underpaid, being removed, alienated from the commodities that they produce, then all for the sake of a few people being able to get rich, then the words profits above people becomes more than a slogan if you look at the large scale of poverty. Imperialism is not just the transferal of that economic system to other countries, or the imposition of that economic system onto other countries, but it's also coupled with an enforced acculturation. So let's say in South Africa, as an example, we're seeing an Americanization of culture, and it's leading to a suppression of our own indigenous culture as various cultural groups in South Africa. We're also seeing that imperialism has a global nature. It's an advancement of a capitalist agenda, a prioritization of capitalist interest with a global footprint. So hence, it is easy for an imperialist force like America to occupy Syria, take 90% of its oil, and not care about the impact that taking the oil is going to have on the Syrian economy and the people of Syria, as long as they can get the money from the oil. That is why they're boosting the arms industry, and that is why they had pumped up the Ukrainian war. They didn't care about the hundreds of thousands of people that were going to die, as long as they could make profit out of the arms industry. And we can go to many countries as an example. The viciousness of imperialism is also witnessed if you see the impact on, I said about the impact of sanctions in Syria, but if you look at the impact of sanctions in Cuba, in Venezuela, because those countries don't want to comply with their economic system, purely because those countries don't want to give their companies free rein in exploiting their resources and their people, they are now punishing the people of those countries by applying sanctions. And they are so greedy that they don't care that those people are going to be suffering. So the South African Communist Party believes in social justice, we believe in economic justice, and we believe that that can only be materialized if there is a structural change in the economy. Hence, we advocate for a socialist economic system where the economic resources are distributed more equitably. We are obviously, we are classic Marxist-Leninist, so we appreciate that capital has a role to play in building industry. But ultimately, we are saying that what the state has to have control over strategic resources. The state has to have control over ensuring the supply of basic needs, because we can't have a situation where capital is using basic commodities like water, like electricity, like telecommunications, which has now become a basic need, like healthcare, for profit when people need it to survive. Yeah.
Okay, no, thank you. I just want to get your reflections on the role of social movements and civil society in promoting solidarity with the people of Palestine against the Israeli aggression.
I think that governments alone cannot effect change. That government, I shouldn't say effect change. Government, of course, as a communist, we believe that the state is very instrumental in enabling change. But coming from an anti-apartheid resistance movement, which was largely civil society based, we have seen the power of civil society. And especially now, given the attacks on our government by America and other imperialist forces, it has become imperative that civil society elevates its voice in defense of South Africa and in defense of the people of Palestine. Right now, we have seen a dissipation almost of voices in support of the people of Palestine, because people are saying, oh no, there's a ceasefire agreement, everything is going to be fine. We know that ceasefire was never really agreed to by the Netanyahu administration. We know that even though they released many prisoners, they're not allowed to celebrate it, and as I indicated, the bombings are still continuing in the West Bank, the arrests are still continuing. If we look at the devastation in Jenin, and now they're blocking the delivery of humanitarian aid. So the voice of civil society is very important. We must also say that we have to commend civil society, particularly on how they managed the Palestinian issue, because it's because of civil society. They've pressured even governments in imperialist countries like the UK, like in the US. If we look at the role that students have played and are playing, if we look at the role that workers have played and are playing, where students have had encampments at universities, forcing the universities to divest from companies that are trading with Israel. We're seeing workers across the world refusing to offload or load goods that are coming from or going to Israel. We're seeing civil society and the religious community having vigils and publicly calling for an end to the genocide and for affirming the right of the Palestinians to self-determination. So, but like I was saying, the voice was very, very, very strong a few weeks ago. Now the voice is starting to dissipate a bit, and civil society shouldn't allow that voice to be silenced. That voice should be intensified until the Palestinians get their liberation. We couldn't have had so many tens of thousands die for nothing. And as South Africans, we've experienced the power of international solidarity in facilitating our freedom, and so it's incumbent on us and in the international community as a whole to rise in defense of the Palestinian people.
Thank you on that, and emphasizing the fact that the civil society and social movements must keep on amplifying the fight against the aggression towards the Palestinian people. Comrade Reneva, we're coming to the end of the show, but before we end, we just have a few voice note clips that had came through around the topic of our discussion today, and then I would like you to just do reflections and then closing marks afterwards. So I'm just gonna close our mic so that we could listen to the voice notes.
My name is Bram Hanekom. I'm a board member of Africa for Palestine. Africa for Palestine welcomes South Africa's ongoing solidarity and, of course, indeed, the solidarity provided by the South African Communist Party, whom through their deployees have endlessly advocated for Palestinian human rights and dignity and sovereignty. Africa for Palestine wants to express its satisfaction that over 64% of voters in South Africa voted for political parties that are very clear in their manifestos and mandates in support of Palestine. We also want to highlight the fact that the American government and its proxies in South Africa, the AfriForums and South African Jewish Board of Deputies, are misleading the public into thinking that should we jump to the beck and call of America, that suddenly we would get the aid that was sent previously and indeed the tariff and trade benefits. The truth is actually that Donald Trump has punished their closest ally and biggest trading partner, Canada, with a 25% tariff on all imported products. They have also taken away humanitarian aid across the entire world, not just South Africa. So essentially they're trying to bully us, but they don't even have the leverage that they wish they had to bully us with. So the government must remain resolute, South Africans must remain resolute, stick by our morals and respect our democratic outcomes. Amandla.
Now I'll just play a clip from the Communist Party of Swaziland.
I am Comrade Simpwe Dlamini, the International Secretary of the Communist Party of Swaziland. We stand in solidarity with the oppressed people of the world and unequivocally condemn the ongoing aggression perpetrated by the Israel state against the Palestinian people. This aggression is not only a violation of international law but also a blatant disregard for the human right and dignity. The systematical oppression displacement and violation against the Palestinians must be condemned in the strongest terms. We call upon the international community to hold Israel accountable for the action and to support the resolution that protects human rights of the Palestinian people. The situation in Syria remains dire. The ongoing conflict exacerbated by the foreign intervention and international division. We urge all factions within Syria to prioritize nation unity over sectarian and political device. It is imperative that we uphold Syria's sovereignty and territorial integrity. Any foreign interference must be condemned and the Syrian people should be allowed to determine their own future. We advocate for an inclusive dialogue amongst all Syrian groups to foster peace and rebuild the nation. Unity and cooperation amongst the Syrian people are essential to the overcoming the challenge they face. We reinstate our firm stance against Israel aggression and our unwavering support for the unity of the Syrian people. Let us work together to promote peace, justice, and solidarity across the region. Thank you very much, comrade.
Lastly, we just have a voice clip from the Zimbabwean Communist Party.
Unity in action, solidarity forever, building.
Sorry about that. I think it was named wrongly.
I am Ian Beddoes from the Zimbabwe Communist Party. I am International Secretary for the SACP. This is a very interesting podcast because it's happening at a time when the USA, the major imperialist power in the world, under Donald Trump, is changing its strategy to the rest of the world. We see that Trump is withdrawing from Ukraine because realistically he's recognized that he cannot win the war against Russia, and that the Ukraine war is sucking in resources for the USA. Now, at the same time, we know that in Latin America, he's trying to renew the Monroe Doctrine to retake control of Latin America and the whole of the Americas. And in the Middle East, we see him as being more aggressive in support of the state of Israel than even the Democrats before him. I'd like to state that we, as the ZCP, do not support the two-state solution, except maybe as an interim strategy. We only see peace coming with a single secular Palestinian state. What we'd also like to know is Syria has been taken over by jihadists, and the majority of Syrians, even the Sunnis, are not hardcore jihadists. So we want to know, is the opposition in Syria growing to this thing? And what's happening with Iran? There's a lot of questions because there's a new strategy which is not yet fully clear, but perhaps you can clarify at least some of what is happening in the Middle East. Thank you.
Thanks, Comrade Reneva. I think the ZCP, as much as they had a comment, they also had a question that was posed through to you. Then also, can you just reflect on the comments that were sent through from Africa for Palestine and the Communist Party of Swaziland?
I think we appreciate the sentiments that were expressed in support of the people of Palestine. It is aligned to our position as the South African Communist Party. There is opposition towards the HTS, as indicated, because they had excluded a large support base within the Syrian community. And just like I know the Comrade Ian had mentioned that they are against the two-state solution in Palestine. And we believe, just like we didn't want people to interfere in our negotiations process, the future of Palestine should be determined by the Palestinian people, and our role is just to support them. Likewise, in Syria, the future of Syria should be determined by the people of Syria, and our role would be to support it. In both Palestine and Syria and Lebanon, regrettably, there is a high level of foreign intervention. In Syria in particular, the country is occupied by three entities. It's occupied by the Americans, it's occupied by the Turks, and it's occupied by the Israelis, or the Zionist regime. So, in order for stability to happen in Syria, there must be no political interference from external countries, and those countries should withdraw from the Syrian territory to enable the Syrian people to chart their own way forward. But likewise, those entities that have been dissolved should be reinstated. The Ba'ath Party, the Unified Syrian Communist Party, and all the worker representative movements, the trade unions, they should be unbanned. Also, there should be no discrimination against or repression against the Alawites, against Christians, against any religious community in Syria, to enable a true national dialogue to unfold. I want to conclude by saying that capitalism will never resolve the issues of unemployment, poverty, and inequality. Likewise, imperialism will never resolve those problems, but fundamentally, there will be war for as long as we have imperialism. And only if we unite as left forces and we are coordinated and we are determined, that is the only way that we are going to defeat it. Because capitalism doesn't play. If we see how it has structured itself in our country to try and unseat the liberation movement from power, it is doing that across the world. Whereas we are still differing on small things. We don't have the luxury to do that. The time has come for the left to unite.
Thank you, Comrade Reneva, on that. Thank you for joining us, and thank you for being our first guest that we went live on the podcast. We hope to have you come back on more issues to give us your reflections on the international community as an internationalist that you are. We appreciate the time that you've taken out to come and join us and be hosted by the Red Mic podcast. Thank you to our viewers and listeners. This concludes our episode. Thank you for tuning in. Do remember to like our Facebook page, the South African Communist Party, and also do follow our YouTube channel, the South African Communist Party. Also do subscribe to the channel. Ensure that you also click on the notification button so that you are kept up to date with the episodes as they come. From us, from the SACP Online, adios.